some expressionistic remarks on the occasion of a revisiting of The Open Society and His Enemies by Karl Popper, on the occasion of having read a recent article by the passionary Alexander Dugin on the subject of Soros, whose god is Popper, with Theos in the ancient sense. Cicero, in his book, which is an answer to Plato's Politeia, or what was commonly called the Republic, but which is the preferred translation, is the regime, where regime means something that covers the whole country, such as the difference between Prussia as ruled by a emperor and Deutschland, or Germany as a constitutional state with ruled by a political party with the president. This I give the hope that the immediate vividness of the impression can make up for the lack of law-like order or systematization of the impressions that I've received. First of all, sorry, I didn't. What I wanted to say is that so far as Dugin says Popper is, as it were, above Soros. This is like what Cicero says in De Republica, the answer to Plato's Politeia, where he says that the Theos, which is the Greek word which is used very closely to the sense that Socrates speaks of his daimon, is for the Romans. So Cicero is speaking in the Athens, not necessarily in Plato's Academy, but he was in Athens for a couple of years. He says the usage there is the same as what the Latini, or the Latin-speaking Roman, says when he speaks of the ego arbiter. So that's the exact phrase in the text. And I think we still have a very close sense in the sense of arbitration or judgment. For arbiter, and ego simply means I. So I judge, I arbitrate the issue. So this sense of the daimon in Socrates is very close to the sense of the theos, or the ego arbiter. So this is translated as God because Zeus, Theos, Deus, and then out of the Latin they translated somehow through Anglo-Saxon languages into our word God. So this means in plain language something like what makes sense to somebody, but at the same time also their conscience in the sense of moral conscience, what they believe their duty is. Somehow Soros wants to present it that he has a duty to follow this Karl Popper Open Society notion. At least he likes to present it that way. So when I read Open Society, one thing I think of is that it's a step further than what the problem we would have with historical revisionism in the normal sense of a moral revisionism. So this moral revisionism became only apparent in the 19th century, I believe. So what happened is there were professors and to some extent representatives of the growing middle class who were liberals in the years approaching, let's say, between 1840, the Biedermeier, and so 1848, a little before 1848, and 1870, the Franco-Prussian War. And these people, their main way of contesting the conservative younger class who were in the early stages under the tutelage of Wilhelm I, who was Hohenzollern emperor, who was very competent, who had, of course, Bismarck as his prime minister, gave way in the period that led up to the period we're familiar with, if we're Americans, which is the World War II, which was the intermediary is Wilhelm II. So anybody who would read an autobiography of Wilhelm II would understand why World War II happened, and they could basically wouldn't have to listen to all the nonsense we usually hear about that period. But putting that aside, what was happening is there was something called Kultur program of the liberal professors, and what they would do is not what happens now, but they were almost something closer to the reverse. So they would constantly say, you historians are putting a pro House of Hohenzollern stamp on every sentence you write. So what's the opposite of that today? Howard Zinn, something like that. So does Howard Zinn actually largely say things that are false? No. That's the interesting thing. So this is not a question of saying things that are false, but of this growing distinction between facts and values. So for instance, if you read Howard Zinn, it's sort of like one is hyperbolic. He says, and the Europeans did genocide here, and they did genocide there, and the Europeans did this, and Columbus did that, and genocide, and etc. So how does that seem from the point of view of a classical philologist? It seems like it should be mentioned that genocide isn't even a concept in the time of Columbus, concept of analysis that was used by people to understand what was happening historically. That should at least be mentioned, I think, that we're using concepts that are not from the time period. Then we can try to also introduce some kind of question of when are we just giving the so-called chronicle our facts, and when are we doing history in some sense, where we have categories of analysis which lead us to a theory of why history is happening. So today almost all history is done in a sense which could be described from, let's say, from the point of view of the Islamic world as Marxist, because all history is done with an awareness that we should pay attention to the categories of the means of production and how the society materially organizes itself, and puts somewhat less emphasis on the quote-unquote ideology, or the ideas of the principles of the society. That's almost universal, I think, among professional historians today, and it stands out and it's noticed by people that don't have that standard, which means, I think, especially in Islamic countries. Now, what were the historians doing in Prussia? What they were doing is praising patriotism in some sense, and the House of Hohenzollern, and remembering that the universities and people working for the universities were directly under the supervision of in the first half of the Catholics still, and then under the supervision of after 18. Okay, I might not have all this totally accurate, but in any case, by 1870, they were under the supervision um, of government officials. So it's not like here where the universities are mostly private, and originally were most of the elite universities in America were founded in order to train pastors, um, and now exist for the sake of uh, producing the most possible certificates that can create the most possible money for the person that buys the training. So it's a different situation. The universities were part of the Prussian thing, and they were subordinated and supervised. And so the professors, in some cases, openly said, "This is why I'm writing this history book for the glory of Prussia," something along those lines. Not always, but that was more the tendency. And then the liberal professors, what they would do is the opposite of now, is what they would do is they would appeal to total philological and scientific rigor, and they would keep saying, "But why are you saying whatever?" Was the equivalent of saying genocide, genocide, genocide in the Howard Zinn version. It's instead saying glory, glory to the Prussian militarism. Peace is a dream, and not even a beautiful dream, because in God's order, war teaches us sacrifice and duty, and then those virtues carry back into daily life, and praising. So, in other words, praising the virtues of the younger class, who are the military class, who are the ruling class of Prussia. And so there is this war based on what is the standard of a proper text, and what counts as moral imbecilism with regard to disregarding this standard. So I would say Popper's book. So all this, in order to say Popper's book, we cannot possibly subject Popper's book to verification of any standard, even within this anarchy of between the 19th and 20th century version of what history ought to be and how it ought to be done, and what there's one saying is ideal chronicler is not yet a historian. So a historian must have some analytical concepts to use in order to say this is what's happening in the country. For instance, the concept of class, for instance, which plays a big role in Marxist analysis of history. So you could have a chronicle and not have any special concept of class, but all historians use some kind of conceptual matrices, and this we call the study of these we call historiology. But okay, Popper, there's no way you can subject him to something like that, because he says immediately at the beginning of the book, and something extreme freedom he announces for himself. He says, "Listen, I hate Plato, but I like Socrates, and so I'm trying to hold you to any." I'm just going to say nasty things about Plato and good things about Socrates. He doesn't continue on to say what any ethical philologist would say. It was just that you can't really, it's very difficult to make any distinction between Plato and Socrates in the dialogues of Plato. It's very difficult to, and even if you have the comparison of Aristophanes and Xenophon's version of Socrates, still it's not anything that can be done in a airtight way. But Popper is simply not interested in any standard of ethical philology. So philology means we try to keep the most lauter, or the sort of the pure or clear, the quartz crystal clear access to these texts. So, which means we want to know what were the conditions in the world in Plato's day. We want to know as much about daily life in Plato's time as we can. We want to know about the usage of the Greek language. That what puns are Plato making? We want close, thorough understanding of the linguistic problems. We want somebody who, like Strauss, speaks Greek and can pore over the text very carefully, and hopefully also who has some talent for it so they can read it profoundly also. We want real access to what was thought and how this looked for the remote ancestors of our own political discussions. So we want to know things like, for instance, Leo Strauss says political philosophy. If you say it straightforwardly, it means recommendations for the lawmakers, for the people who make laws. So taking all that into account, I suppose we shouldn't be surprised at how wild and outlandish the things Popper writes are, and how it's basically just make-believe, but it's still been very powerful. So if you look at it by his standard, what he's saying is he appeals to people like Walter Lippmann, who's a later voice of the view, which is in power in America, at least in some sense, that public opinion and the right, which is supposed to be preservative of all other rights, is I will cite Justice Roberts as saying in his confirmation hearing to the Supreme Court, is meant to uphold so-called liberal democracy, which is of course not called liberal democracy at the founding of the American order, but in any case democracy. It would, I believe, what else is one appealing to when one constantly says in the American situation that as a Supreme Court justice, one is an unelected official and we are supposed to be bowing to the people. In the Constitution, by the way, in the preamble, when it's signed, we the people, that was originally signed we the undersigned, so it meant just the people at the Constitutional Convention originally, but then they recast it, we the people. So what is Popper appealing to? If you look at Popper as though through the lens of the standard of rhetoric, straightforward rhetoric. So Aristotle says the original logic was rhetoric, and he gives these three categories of rhetoric and so on. But what it really means is Popper's saying some people are talking about open and closed society, some people are talking about Plato, what's all the talk about? And he just says whatever he can say to appeal to everyone, let's say, or to appeal to the popular opinion. Now, he doesn't, of course, preference it by saying, if I were, he makes his remark, I don't give a damn about Plato, I hate Plato, I'm going to say whatever I want, and if I have anything good to say about Plato, I'm going to call it Socrates. He does say that, but he doesn't say what I said about classical philology and the ethics of that, which one could find better statements of that in Nietzsche, for instance, or in Strauss, that we want to keep the access open properly to the text. So anybody that has this view that that the science of philology is valuable is not going to get anything from the open society and its enemies. But maybe, on the other hand, as with Hegel, this sense that absolute presupposition, and then he just says what he wants to say, and maybe he says something interesting even though it has nothing to do with the philologically verifiable, something we can subject to verification by any standard, because he doesn't really give us a standard. The only standard is whether we like what he says or not. um, Popper seems to, in some sense, produce um, an intelligible case for um, liberalism, in this sense that liberalism is, as Strauss says in one of his seminar courses, the wager that the right to lie, free speech, will lead to something good. So he says, for instance, in his excoriation of Mr. Plato, who he treats as though Plato were not the origin of the idea of rationality, not the font at Horizo of the not this memorably awesome moment called the Greek miracle, where for the first time the mere sort of noises human beings were making at one another was, as it were, cut through. The truisms were cut through. An actual investigation of the world were attempted, not the moment when, for the first time, the mere fact that there were wealthy people, aristocrats, was distinguished from the notion of who really should, Aristotle means best, so who really should we be saying are the best people. So it's as though, if we were merely picking out any rich people, so if you're right wing, then you'll say Warren Buffett or Zuckerberg or something. We could use that as an example. Are those really the best people? And then if you're left wing, we can say Trump or Ivanka Trump. Are these really the geniuses? That I had the experience of somebody telling me Ivanka Trump is a genius. So it's sort of like, well, if you're a billionaire and or the daughter of a billionaire, and you have all kinds, and your father is in office as a president, and you can talk to anyone you want. I don't think it's that hard to make money. So, yeah, it's like, I'm selling Ivanka Trump bras or whatever, and then people want to buy it because there's lots of people that like the Trump brand anyway. So it's like you're sort of like a fatted cow that's been put in the right barnyard, as it were. It's not that hard to do well when you're in that situation. It doesn't make... but in any case, the question is then, are these actually the best people simply because they're in a privileged position? Are these the real aristocrats? What is that? So this is the question is raised for the first time in Plato and Socrates. Socrates first puts the first, I think, substantial definition of rationality in first. I think of Nietzsche's comment, these little bigots who come in and all the time comment on these matters, which are matters that are far beyond anything any human being should be able to even address, almost like life, truth, how we should live, what the law should be, and what reality is, and so on. Why do we think that we can all... Karl Popper thinks he can come in and say anything serious about the matter when he's never... he has no training in even reading text properly. He's a psychologist who probably wrote with some knowledge of how to manipulate people, I think. And then, just like on a lower level, I think, Noah Harari, what happens is he says so many outrageous things that enough people that are serious feel like they need to address it to the general public. And then that makes him even stronger, because you cannot possibly address the general public about things which take a decade of study to really appreciate, right? It would be like if Mozart wanted to explain there's a music that he's been studying since he's 5 years old, and we're tone deaf, and we can't key into what he's saying, but you can't. It's just an impossible thing. Where, and in fact, even all the people who try to show how stupid what Popper's saying is, to some extent, increase his power. So I mean, I think even on the regular page, Walter Kaufman has said Popper has simply used the very totalitarian methods that he's supposedly against, because it's just constant nonsense and bullshit every page. It has nothing to do with the actual history, but it has a certain meaning. It whistles a certain tune, so we can understand what side he's on. But it's just it can only be taken totally outside the, as I've just been saying, totally outside this horizon of something we can verify as having any scientific sense, in the sense that classical philology is a science, because etymology is a science, because history and knowing what was happening at the time and understanding the situation in some reasonable way corresponding to how Plato and Socrates understood it, the Peloponnesian War, the Thucydides, etc., what was going on at the time. So, I mean, I would say in my version, I would say there's some people called Pisistratus, the Pisistratus the tyrant was the philosopher king is based on, probably, for Plato. I can't say that for sure, but about 600 BC, and this was the time when Draco and Plato's ancestor Solon came in with the laws, and Plato kind of makes a play on that, because the Pisistratus had something like a bodyguard, which is something like the Praetorian Guard later of the Roman emperors, like a foreign bodyguard, because people hated him so much, and that's the only way. But so what is Plato saying? He's saying, what if instead of Pisistratus being for himself, he was for rational government, which Plato actually invented, but Popper is trying to tell us that he was against it. Rational government in the substantial sense that Socrates says in the Politeia, that dike or justice means that which is improving of the citizens. So then Popper, an example, another of his just flat nonsense, keeps repeating the phrase the state, oh, Plato's for the state, but actually he says dike or justice is that which improves the citizens. Popper says, oh, Plato thinks, so he doesn't say Socrates, of course, is the one that actually says it. Oh, Plato says that justice is that which serves the state. So then Strauss brings in another criticism here, which is that state is really a term which is due to the period following, like absolutism in France. So, la tête moi, I am the state, King Louis. So, basically what happened after about 1500, after Martin Luther had thrown off the yoke of Catholicism, what happened is instead of the Catholic Church saying what divinity wanted, it was switched over to a theory of the divine right of kings. And the reason for this was, I believe, so why did that happen in the Catholic countries, where the Catholics were still going? Why did it happen in France? It's because in order to compete with the Protestant countries, they had to give more power to the executive, and something along those lines, I believe, must have been what happened. But in any case, the division between state and society we owe to this modern period leading up to the French Revolution. It didn't exist in Plato's time, even though Popper is constantly speaking of the state and the state. So, but it were fair to Popper, which he never is, to the subjects of his own discourse. I think if we're philologically fair, we have to say, what does Popper think he means by the state? He means the politeia. So he's using the term politeia to mean the state, but then it's there's no contrast between state and country in the Greek discussion. There's something like the contrast between the current play being put on in the playhouse, like say they're playing Strindberg's Dance of Death Part 2, and then the theater troupe, which are the citizens. That's the contrast meant by the politeia regime. It's the country and the hylic nature of it, the material, meaning the people, their bodies, are the same, but the way they will live is according to a different bugle call, if you like. They follow the bugle call has laid down by the politeia, that's, or by the playwright who writes that script. So, but Popper seems to mean, if we're fair to him, and what he means is he thinks that this figure which mirrors the 6th century BC Pisistratus with his private bodyguard, so the philosopher king and the guardians are supposed to be the state. But does that make the slightest bit of sense? Because Plato has told us what his analogy is of a ship at sea. So he's describing the period of the Peloponnesian Wars, where there's kind of like the captain or the pilot of the ship. So the word is cyber actually in Greek, has no credential for piloting that ship. He doesn't know what he is doing. He's a little hard of hearing. His sight is poor. He doesn't understand the art or science of navigation. He doesn't know where the ship ought to be going. He doesn't understand the tides. He understands nothing. So he's just out. This is an analogy on Pisistratus, who's just basically like a Saudi prince who says, I own the country, and there's nothing more to be said. I'll do what I want arbitrarily with that country, except that he probably wants to help his own sons and his bodyguard to do well, which are supposedly the state. But what's Plato's saying here, he's saying, Plato or Socrates, who are basically indistinguishably saying, wouldn't it be better if the person who ruled actually had a competence, who was actually competent and knew how to, because there is such a thing as the art of navigation, there is such a thing as knowing how to steer the ship properly, there is such a thing as understanding how the tides work, and so on. These are all sciences. So that's the whole, that's the essential thing that Plato and Socrates are for rational rule, rather than this tyrannical arbitrary rule. But Popper presents this as though we were talking about the very thing that Plato's against. So what was Plato against? During the democracy, the so-called democracy, but then what does the democracy mean? It has the double meaning, just like aristocracy has the double meaning. Aristocracy means both the people that are actually the wealthy people, who are considered to be the best by birth in that culture, or in our culture, maybe the so-called billionaire class is in the same position, and the people who are viewed scientifically are viewed to actually be competent and be doing what's improving the citizens, to use Plato or Socrates' definition. Popper actually blames Plato as though Plato were both in favor of the billionaire class and somehow also against this democracy. But actually, what's the real condition? as we all know, it's what's been called liberal democracy is a very much in a sort of a Twilight Zone situation where the Twilight Zone episode, The Eye of the Beholder, where the woman has the bandages come off and she's a beautiful woman, but the doctors and the nurses and everyone else are hideously deformed. So it's kind of a double vision situation. So that we're constantly told it's liberal democracy, but we could also see it as a sort of oligarchy or plutocracy, because we have government takeover and the so-called how does the Eisenhower termed military-industrial complex, which is no longer industrial, but the military technological complex or something like that, and Atlanticism and so on. So if you take the situation as it actually was, rather than how Popper does and say idealize the supposed democratic features which exist, but extracting them from the oligarchic or plutocratic features, which, for instance, the old man at the beginning of the Politeia is an arms dealer, a medic, who lives down on the Piraeus, because that's where the arms dealers lived in ancient Athens at that time. In the time between there's like 30 years between the two Peloponnesian Wars of peace. So I think that's when the Politeia, or the Republic, takes place. So there's all these games going on, but what is the intelligible message that Popper's giving if you just abstract from any question of whether he's telling us anything useful about reality, but rather he's telling us how he wants to understand the political situation. He's saying, so far as I can understand him, that people that are for democracy are for public opinion affecting what happens in the country in such a way that it corresponds to the Kantian wager, which is also the Aufklärung, or the Enlightenment wager, which is, I think it's put sometimes like, sunlight is the best disinfectant, but also just that if you allow people to talk, somehow there eventually the truth will come out, right? This kind of view, which is still back behind a lot of the political support for something like the current American system, which is also at the same time the system which, in a certain way, Soros, even though it's, of course, the right wing in America hates Soros, but even though, according to, if you look at it from this point of view of Dugin's article, you can see that Soros is basically put above every possible engine of the rich North Atlantic West, so including, of course, the CIA. So I have an interesting aside there, which is that we're told by right-wing American conspiracists that the CIA produced this phrase, conspiracy theory, which is ironic because actually the phrase, even though I suppose it existed back in the 19th century or whatever, but the way it came into American usage is exactly from Karl Popper's book, The Open Society and Its Enemies, where he lays out a little synoptical understanding of what conspiracy theory means. It means a certain view about what the most effective forces behind political life are. That came out in 1945. So that's when the phrase became part of the general educated usage, conspiracy theory. So this is actually predates long before this CIA document that the conspiracy theorists constantly adduce to say, oh, the CIA entered this phrase into usage in order to um, hide what they did to JFK, right? So that's when I think the document's like a year or two after the JFK assassination. Um, but it is interesting that in Dugin's article, he basically says palindrome. Soros is that's what they used to call him when he was a FX trader, foreign exchange trader, and the man that how did they call it? The man that beat the Bank of England, or I forget the right phrase for that, but took the Bank of England for a number of billions of dollars. But he puts Soros as a kind of God figure up above every form of Western power, including the CIA. So in that sense, there's kind of this full circle, because Soros's God is Popper, and Popper's God has actually produced this phrase in the American academic usage. This views in Popper are worth reading in the same way that looking into the entrails of a tortoise or something are worth reading. There's something worth reading in them. They say something, and they remind me of the worst forms of the conspiracy theorists in America. That they're still nonetheless saying something, like the chemtrails or whatever. They're saying something in a way, even though it's total bullshit from any scientific or ethical point of view. I'll end by saying one thing I noticed in what Popper was doing. I have to admit that when I was trying to bring out a wider understanding of Hegel, I myself was guilty of saying, Hegel doesn't believe in the corporal punishment, which is false. But I didn't. I thought that because Hegel does come out and say against some people that their reasoning behind corporal punishment is bad, and then when I was criticized, and what I wanted to do is show what I still think is true, is that Hegel is showing this view of gradual softening, so that, for instance, Hegel is against slavery, so has been admitted. So Aristotle was in favor of slavery, Hegel is against it. So there's sort of view that the Enlightenment also means a gradual improvement of things. So, and then I wanted to link that to that Hegel's absolute or end is at this place, which is not at all like the conditions of the harshness of, the ancient Romans were excessively harsh people, and we can see a lot of harshness in the ancient world, which are at least according to Hegel's standard is like not necessarily whether they do a thing or not, but whether they think it's wrong. So like it's good at least that people think cannibalism is wrong, supposedly, according to Hegel's way of thinking. Whether or not they de facto do it is the second issue. But if they really think it's wrong, then any break against it is either just kind of outbreak of madness, or it's a kind of romantic move, but eventually they'll come back to their senses if they know that something is wrong. And then you can kind of link that to Scalia, where Scalia is saying there's a certain evolutionary content in certain clauses of the Constitution, including the issue of what he says he hates is the lash, and the lash was a normal thing at the time of the founders. So when they said cruel and unusual punishment, that wasn't not an unusual punishment, at least it was very usual, whereas now it would be unusual. So the evolutionary content would consist of having to say by that standard is actually a standard which speaks to is relative to the time, relative to our time. The lash is unusual, so it couldn't be allowed in the way it could in the time of the founders, and then that doesn't even require an amendment or anything. It could just be read directly, I think is what we can infer from what Scalia said on that point. In a way, maybe he was making a little nod to certain people on the in the Congress who were had to decide whether to confirm his nomination or not, which they did, I think, almost possibly unanimously, I think, which is can't happen now because it's only being done on a strictly party line. Okay, so I'll leave it at that for now.